All right, so this is lecture 6 of Josephus by Rabbi Lawrence Truster, January 14th. Okay, so we're going to continue with our look at the various categories of that Josephus uses to describe the people involved in the war. And we talked about how the term brigand, lestes, is used in a variety of ways to both denote people who were revolutionaries that he traces back to the period just after Herod's death in the year 6. All the way, he uses the term throughout the works. Sometimes, of course, a brigand is just a brigand, meaning people who are robbing, but the divide line between people who are against the regime and people who are just out there trying to survive as robbers, of course, is a thin line, because social problems often drove people off into a life of brigandage. So it's very hard to kind of focus. But the term Sicarii is used very particularly to, it seems to be a group that there's some roots in the 40s, but certainly in the 60s, this group of Sicarii who seem to be urban assassins, and they seem to target primarily Jews who they consider, their fellow Jews, who they consider to be collaborators with the Romans. So famously, they assassinated the high priest Jonathan. Interestingly enough, there are two versions of the story, and in one version, in fact, Josephus claims it was the Roman procurator who instigated the assassination of Jonathan. But the Sicarii do appear in the war, but they really don't take part in the fighting. They capture Masada and stay in Masada for the duration of the war, raiding their own people's villages around Masada for supplies. And of course, they will be the last group of revolutionaries who will be killed at the siege of Masada in 74. That will be the end of the war. But another important designation for revolutionaries is the term zealot. In Greek, zelotes, coming from what the word meaning, passionate, and it would appear that they are a group of revolutionaries. They appear as a significant group during the war, especially during the siege of Jerusalem. And the question is, who are they? And we're going to start by looking at the first time they're introduced, which is on page 765. This is the Jewish War, Book 2, chapter 22. Paragraph 2, line 651. So again, this is the second book of the Jewish Wars, chapter 22. It's the last chapter of the book, of that book. Paragraph.
It's actually the end of paragraph.
And you're right. It's the end of paragraph 1, line 651, and this is on page 765 in our edition. So he's talking about around 66, at the time of the around the outbreak of the war, and here is in line 61. He's talking about the high priest and so on, people getting ready for it.
Where are you again?
Line 651. 765, line 651.
651.
Yes. So, Suzanne, you want to begin where it says, however?
However, Ananus' concern was this: to lay aside for a while the preparations for the war, and to persuade the seditious to consult their own interest, and to restrain the madness of those that had the name of zealots. But their violence was too hard for him, and what end he came to we shall relate hereafter.
So there is a group of people who he specifically calls zealots, who seem to be a more radical group in terms of the war. Like as we will see when we look closely at the outbreak of the war begins as a kind of popular revulsion and uprising against the procurator, who has done some really horrible things. And it wasn't really a revolt against the empire, but against this particular official. So there is a kind of moderate group of people who start the revolt, but there's also, as we saw, a whole group of people, including the Pharisees, who are trying to stop it. They are the peace party, we would say. So the high priest is attempting, on the one hand, to placate the legitimate anger of the people by like they've chased the Roman garrison out of the city, and while preparing for a fight, he's hoping to calm things down and deal with it from there, to negotiate with the Romans, and all that kind of stuff. Because they've done that before. There was where there was a procurator who was really bad, and they appealed to the emperor, and the guy was removed. But notice he says, persuade the seditious to consult their own interests. In other words, to sort of say, look what you're doing, and to restrain the madness of those that had the name of zealots. So there is this faction that is obviously far more radical that he blames subsequently for really keeping the war going, and as you will see, results in internal killings. In other words, there comes a point where the radicals begin to kill the moderates. And in fact, at one point even, Titus basically says, why should we lay siege to Jerusalem? They're killing each other off anyway. So, so let's take a look in Book 4 now of the war, Chapter 5. Page 813. It's Chapter 5, 813. And we're going to begin right at the beginning of the chapter. What happens is that during the war, the radicals on the inside are. This is in chapter 4. They call for a group of Idumeans. Now, if you remember, the Idumeans were ethnically not Judeans, but they were Judean by religion. And they had this had happened back in the time of John Hyrcanus, some 200 years, more than 200 years before this, where the Idumeans had been forcibly converted to Judaism as a religion and citizenship. So what's interesting is this is a group of Jewish Idumeans who are rural for the most part. And so this large group of them, this large military group of them, has been called into the city and ally themselves with the Zealots. They eventually fall out, by the way, and start killing each other. But the point is, you'll get an idea of this from this passage, starting in the beginning of chapter 5, line 305. So, Suzanne, why don't you continue on this advice?
This advice pleased the Idumeans, and they ascended through the city to the temple. The Zealots were also in great expectation of their coming, and earnestly waited for them. When, therefore, these were entering, they also came boldly out of the inner temple, and mixing themselves with the Idumeans, they attacked the guards, and some of those that were upon the watch, but were fallen asleep, they killed as they were asleep. But as those that were not now awakened made a cry, the whole multitude arose, and in the amazement they were in, caught hold of their arms immediately, and betook themselves to their own defense.
Okay, what happens is that the Zealots have been pushed. They've been pushed by the rest of the authorities in Jerusalem. They've gone into the temple, and they're holding the temple sort of as a stand against the rest, not against the Romans, against the rest of the authorities in Jerusalem. So they call in the Idumeans, who manage to get into the city and try to break the siege of the temple where the Zealots are now. So you see there's a distinction between the groups, that the Zealots seem to be a very distinct group. Most historians believe they're rural primarily, but they take a large part in this internecine fighting that transposes what's going on in a more radical direction. That's a point. And they get the Idumeans to ally themselves with them. Okay? I mean, we don't have to read any further, but if you do, you'll see it's, there's massive killings, internecine killings that go on in the city during the war, and even during the siege. All right? So one last reference there are a lot of references to the Zealots, so I'm just giving you a touch upon it very closely. If you look in Book 4, Chapter 9, 828, chapter 9, chapter 9, paragraph 12. Here, you're going to see another stage in the radicalization where there's even a more radical group than the Zealots, led by a guy named Simon ben Giora. All right? So, Muriel, do you want to pick it up on paragraph 12, line 577? Thus did Simon
get possession of Jerusalem, and in the 3rd year of the war, in the month Athicus and Nisan, whereupon John, with his multitude of zealots, as being both prohibited from coming out to the temple, and having lost their power in the city, for Simon and his party had plundered them of what they had, were in despair of deliverance. Simon also made an assault upon the temple with the assistance of the people, while the others stood up upon the cloisters and the battlements and defended themselves from their assaults. However, a considerable number of Simon's party fell, and many were carried off wounded, for the Zealots threw darts easily from a superior place and seldom failed of hitting their enemies. But having the advantage of situation, and having withal erected 4 very large towers aforehand, that their darts might come from higher places, one of the northeast corner of the court, one above the Xystus, the third at another corner over against the lower city.
He's describing the compound, the temple compound, which had walls around it, which the present, western wall and the southern wall are the remnants of. So remember, the temple was surrounded by a wall. It was a compound, and it was a very good place to defend because you could shoot, if you know Jerusalem, you can shoot down because there are valleys that went around this wall, at least on the on 3 sides. Right, there are deep valleys. Any of you who've ever been underneath the wall know how far down the original level was. So very deep valley on the west side, on the south side, and on the east side. The only place where it becomes fairly level is in the northwest corner, right? Okay. Go on.
And the last was erected above the top of the Pastophoria, where one of the priests stood, of course, and gave a signal beforehand with a trumpet. At the beginning of every seventh day, in the evening twilight, as also at the evening when the day was finished, as giving notice to the people when they were to leave off work and when they were to go to work.
This is one of the descriptions where this is the southwest corner of the compound, and I think I mentioned this before. When archaeologists were digging around that corner, they actually found the place where the priest would stand to blow the shofar to warn people of the coming of the Sabbath. They found a cornerstone that actually says the place of the shofar. So go on. These men
also set their engines to cast darts and stones withal upon those towers with their archers and slingers. And now Simon made his assault upon the temple more faintly, by reason that the greatest part of the men grew weary of that work. Yet he did not leave off his opposition, because his army was superior to the others. Although the darts which were thrown by the engines were carried a great way, and slew many of those that fought for him.
So Simon ben Giora is laying siege to the Zealots in the temple. And so, just as a reminder from the timeline, the original group of who led the revolution was a provisional government headed by the high priest Ananus, who eventually gets killed by the radicals, by the way. They murder him. And then what happens is so that's from 66 to 68. In 68 is when the Zealots take over. But then they control the city for about a year. But then they're chased, into the temple by Simon Bar Giora, who is the most radical of the three groups that headed the revolution. Simon Ben Giora was the last one and was in charge at the time of the siege, but he never completely killed off the Zealots. They managed to.
He was more radical.
Yes, he was more radical than the Zealots.
Wow.
Okay, Simon Ben Giora.
Why wouldn't, silly question, I guess, why wouldn't those two radical groups come together? I know, silly question.
Have you read the history of the French Revolution? Once you get this kind of radical thing set up, it's human behavior that it often, and when have two Jews ever agreed on anything? The point is, you have this factionalization within the revolutionary bodies. That is one of the reasons why they lost. I mean, they were probably you couldn't probably defeat the Romans. The only way they could have hoped to defeat the Romans if they could have brought the Parthians in. So it's just one of those things that happened. Yeah,
Am I correct in that there was a real minority of Jews that wanted to fight the Romans?
Yes, exactly.
So most of the people did not want anything to do with it?
No, most of the people were trapped in Jerusalem. He says earlier that because the whole thing started around the time of Passover, when the Romans arrived there, one of the tactics that the Romans used for sieges, they wouldn't let anybody out, even those who wanted to get out. So, because it was a way of starving people. So Jerusalem had a much larger population when the siege started, originally there were legitimate reasons why people were angry at the Roman procurator, so the original revolutionary government, which appointed Josephus as general of Galilee, was really a group that would have been very happy to negotiate with the Romans but very quickly more radical factions took over, and there was no way. So by the time the Romans arrived in front of Jerusalem after having conquered the Galilee, Jerusalem was really in the hands of the Zealots, and then things got worse. And the groups were fighting amongst each other, and the poor population was stuck in the middle. Okay?
I think I don't know whether most Jews are aware that at the time most of the people did not want this war with the Romans.
They did not.
No, I'm saying that today. I'm wondering whether most Jews are even aware of that.
They're probably not.
Yeah. It reminds me of the American Revolution. I mean, that most of the people did not want to fight the British.
Right. And as you know, tens of thousands ended up leaving the states for settlement in Nova Scotia and what becomes Ontario because, and there was some pretty horrible fighting between those who remained loyal to the British Crown. There were a lot of atrocities were committed against the Loyalists. And I think that in this particular war, and in the Galilee, there were cities that refused to participate because they knew what would happen if the Roman army came. What's interesting is that 70 years later, the Bar Kokhba revolt, we don't have a Josephus to really describe the war, but it seems from the sources we have that there was a big difference with the Bar Kokhba revolt, that the revolt was much wider at that time. There was a lot more support for it because of what had happened, because the Romans refused to allow them to rebuild the temple. They were turning it into a pagan city because they were seizing land. I mean, there's a lot of, the Bar Kokhba war is a very big problem of interpretation because of our lack of sources, because the rabbinic sources are mostly legendary and written down hundreds of years later, and the Roman sources are there's very few references to it. But we know that it was, in many ways, in terms of actual casualties, the Bar Kokhba war was much worse than this war. It was more widespread and was a lot worse, upwards to at least 500,000 people killed in the Bar Kokhba revolt.
As a percentage of the population?
Huge percent, probably, I can't even begin to guess. But the point is, it was also, the Romans suffered a lot worse because at the end of a revolt, it was traditional for the emperor to send a message to the Senate that he and his legions were well. And it's reported by Roman historians that they did not. So evidently, it appears that in the early stages of the revolt, they were killed off slaughtered a couple of the Roman legions, and the Romans show you the seriousness of it, had to bring legions from as far away as Germany and Britain to help put down the Bar Kokhba revolt. That's how bad it was. So it was much worse. Whatever we know about it, it appears it was much worse than this, where there were whole cities who just refused to participate. There were populations that were really not interested in it, but they were caught by the radicals in the city.
And it still took the Romans 4 years.
Partly that was because of what happened when the Vespasian had to go back to Rome, and there was a period of instability. It was a short sort of period of civil war in Rome itself. That kind of delayed things quite a bit because they put everything on hold while that was happening for a couple of years. Okay, so we're going to leave the war for the moment and take a look quickly at some other groups two other groups that Josephus mentions, and the first is the Samaritans. And there's a certain I only gave you one reference. There's a number of references to the Samaritans. If you go to the Antiquities of the Jews, chapter 9, this is one of them, where he describes who they were. The Samaritans are still around today, by the way. They're a small group of them. They live in what the area called Samaria, which is north of Jerusalem, centered around what the city of Nablus today is sort of the heart of what was Samaria. There was an ancient city of Samaria, and they had a temple. Nablus is there are two mountains which are mentioned in the Torah as being the places where, after the Israelites conquered the land, Joshua convenes the people on these two mountains, and they do this whole covenant ceremony. And later on, the Samaritans built a temple on one of them, on Mount Gerizim. But who were they? That's the interesting point. They're very similar to the Jews, but they're not Jews. They're not Judeans. By the way, the story of the Good Samaritan in the New Testament is rather interesting because why is he called the Good Samaritan? Because Jews hated the Samaritans, and the Samaritans hated the Jews for the most part, and so this was a good one. This is a good Samaritan. The rest of them are bastards, but this was a good one, So it's kind of interesting. And here he calls them also the Kuthians, which is sort of what the term used in rabbinical literature for them. And so if you go to page 316, chapter 9, book 9, chapter 14, paragraph 3 on 316 and line 288. So Irma, do you want to begin reading that?
But now the Kuthians who removed into Samaria, for that is the name they have been called by to this time, because they were brought out of the country called Cutha, which is a country of Persia, and there's a river of the same name in it. Each of them, according to their nations, which were in number 5, brought their own gods into Samaria, and by worshipping them, as was the custom of their own countries, they provoked Almighty God to be angry and displeased at them.
Now, he's actually quoting the Bible here, pretty much. He's paraphrasing a section of 2 Kings, where the northern kingdom of Israel has been destroyed by the Assyrians around 720 or so BCE. And the Assyrians, they were the first ones who used deportation as a means of basically putting down revolts. Mm-hmm. So they had deported a certain percentage of the northern kingdom. These become in legend the 10 lost tribes. They're actually fewer than 10, but the point is they deport a certain percentage of the population, and they bring in people from somewhere else to settle there who bring their own gods. And there's a whole incident where, keep reading.
Okay.
For a plague.
For a plague seized upon them, by which they were destroyed. And when they found no cure for their miseries, they learned by the oracle that they ought to worship Almighty God as the method for their deliverance. So they sent ambassadors to the king of Assyria and desired him to send them some of those priests of the Israelites whom he had taken captive. And when he thereupon sent them, and the people were by them taught the laws and the holy worship of God, they worshipped him in a respectful manner, and the plague ceased immediately. And indeed, they continue to make use of the very same customs to this very time, and are called in the Hebrew tongue Kuthians, but in the Greek Samaritans. And when they see the Jews in prosperity, they pretend that they are changed and allied to them, and call them kinsmen, as though they were derived from Joseph, and had by that means an original alliance with them. But when they see them falling into a low condition, they say they are in no way related to them, and that the Jews have no right to expect any kindness or marks of kindred from them, but they declare that they are sojourners that come from other countries.
Stop there. So he makes it, and of course he comes back to this and tells how during certain times the Samaritans want to be identified with the Jews, Judeans, and other times no, we don't have any relationship to them. Yeah. But he's paraphrasing 2 Kings, but he is actually reflecting what most historians now believe, that the people that were brought in by the Assyrians mixed with the remnants of the northern tribes and created and became known as Samaritans. They built their own temple. They worship God. They have their own. They have Torahs that they are written in the old alphabet to this day. And what's interesting is the Samaritan. They don't have any other books of the Tanakh. No other books, just the Torah. Mm-hmm. They have their own, traditions and customs about what they do. They practice the Sabbath, circumcision, and so on. But it's interesting, in their Torahs, they kind of have an 11th commandment. They have several references where they've added wherever in the Deuteronomy it says, the place that I shall show you, they add basically Mount Gerizim. In other words, they change it to reflect the idea that the temple should not have been built in Jerusalem, but in Mount Gerizim. And there was a lot of enmity between the Judeans and the Samaritans, to the point where John Hyrcanus conquers Samaria as part of his imperial ambitions, like he conquered Idumea, and he destroys the Samaritan temple. So the reason why, there was a heavy Jewish center in the Galilee, which was separated from Judea by Samaria, and the main road goes right along, to this day, the main highway from Galilee, Lower Galilee, to the Jerusalem area runs along the ridge, which runs through what we call the West Bank, right? The northern part of the West Bank. And Judeans are going to want to come from the Galilee to Jerusalem on pilgrimage. They have to pass through Samaria. Well, Samaritan brigands would often attack Judeans, and there was a lot of problems over this. So in the war, the Samaritans were allied with the Romans. I mean, they tried to kind of keep themselves on the Roman side, and part of what they did was to try and disassociate themselves from the Jews during such times. And so were the Samaritans. They're not really a Judean sect. They're pre-Judean, but they are our cousins, so to speak. They are the remnants of the northern tribes, mixed with these other populations who were brought from the east by the Assyrians. And the thing is, the Samaritans still exist to this day. There aren't that many of them, because they had certain traditions and so on that made it very difficult for them to maintain their population. Namely, they had no conversion, they had no concept of conversion, and they only married within their group, which shrank their population. But sometime in the 20th century, before the State of Israel was created, an Israeli historian anthropologist who was an expert on the Samaritans basically convinced them to say, look, you should allow your sons to marry Jews. And they did. So there was actually, because they were so intermarried into a small group, they had certain distinctive physical features as a result of that lack of genetic diversity. First of all, their skins were a lot whiter than the average population in the area, more like a European than a Middle Eastern. They had long necks, interestingly enough. And the later generation, whose mothers were basically Sephardic, are darker in skin and exhibit some of the characteristics that you would of Jews from Arab countries. When I was an undergraduate at Hebrew University, I took a wonderful class with the anthropologist Dov Noy, who passed away a few years ago, and we went to the Passover sacrifice of the Samaritans, and we met their high priest, because that's what they have. And he spoke English in a beautiful British accent, and basically by this point the Samaritans want to stay, want to ally themselves with Israel. They basically are in Nablus and in Cholon near Tel Aviv, and during the time between 48 and 67, a lot of them couldn't get to the temple, or they don't have a temple, they have the site, and they believe that, which is actually the rules in the book of Exodus, that if you don't attend the Passover sacrifice, you're out. Mm-hmm. So the idea everybody has to go there, and I don't know how they adjusted it during the time a lot of them couldn't get there, but they still do animal sacrifice, but only on Passover. They do the Passover sacrifice because it is not required to be done in a temple. And what happens is, I don't know, because of the intifadas and stuff, I don't know how normal it is, but at the time in 1975, when I was there, they had bleachers, and you could get tickets, and Israelis went and watched the sacrifice.
Mount Gerizim?
Har Gerizim, yeah. It was quite fascinating. And then every family, they'd bring, just exactly was in Exodus. They'd have a lamb, and it was slaughtered, and then they'd go off and, they'd roast it and so on and so forth. But their calendar is different than ours as well. So they're a fascinating group, and they were part of the landscape of Josephus's world. But of course, being a good Judean, he didn't like them. Yeah.
This is a very basic question. I'm going back now to the rebuilding of the temple, where the Samaritans were absolutely not welcome to join.
And other groups, not just the Samaritans.
Right, but specifically the Samaritans, because they worship the same God.
Right.
They read from the same Torah.
Yeah.
Is there any other religion other than the Jewish religion that says it only matters what your birth, what your ancestry is? It doesn't matter what deity you worship. Is there any other religion that does?
No, you're asking a complex question. The fact is that when Israelite religion was what we would call an indigenous religion, you couldn't convert to become an Israelite. It was a national identity. So the notion of your faith, your land, and your ethnic identity were all wrapped up into one. You couldn't become an Israelite. You either were born one or you weren't one. So and it was patrilineal. Okay, mm-hmm. So if a non-Israelite, was residing in the land, they weren't part of the tribal system. They didn't have land, and so on and so forth. And yes, there are evidence in Israelite times of non-Israelites recognizing, God, but they couldn't become part of the nation. They could become a resident alien, the Ger Toshav. Mm-hmm. It's only in the Second Temple period the notion of conversion comes about.
But to your knowledge, is there any other religion?
No, but the term religion is in fact a Western term. When you look at most peoples, they are indigenous. You can't convert to become a Navajo, right?
Okay, right.
It's the same thing. The Navajo are intimately connected between their spirituality, their land, and their people. And you can go live among the Navajo. You can even adopt their practice, but you can't. I mean, yes, there are some native tribes who can adopt. There is adoption, but it's not conversion in the way we understand it, because it's not the notion of a faith the way we understand it. There's a real difference between an indigenous approach and a faith community. Okay? That's a short answer to a very complicated question. Okay. All right, let's.
Than I thought.
What?
I said more complicated than I thought.
Yeah, it is very complicated. All right, so go to book 18 of the Antiquities.
Page.
581. And this is book 18, chapter 5. And paragraph 2. Uh, 18:5-2. Hang on, I'm getting it myself. And this is, we're in line 116. This is about Herod Antipas, who's one of the sons of Herod the Great, whose territory is in the Galilee and that sort of area. And it's all about how he's at a war with the king of Arabia because he divorced the king of Arabia's daughter so he could marry the wife of one of his brothers. I mean, it's this whole thing going on with Herod Antipas, and Herod's army is defeated by the king of Arabia, and in fact, it gets so bad, Herod Antipas writes to local Roman commander to help him out. Okay, so if you look in paragraph 2, line 116, Cal, do you want to pick it up there now? Some of the Jews.
Now, some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly, as a punishment of what he did against John, that was called the Baptist.
Now, this is the first mention outside of the New Testament of John the Baptist, or better translated, John the Immerser. Okay, baptism is a Christian kind of term. Okay, and there's obviously John the Baptist shows up as a very important figure in the Gospels because Jesus becomes a disciple of John the Baptist, and in one of a couple of Gospels they even concoct this kind of genealogy for John, where he's born not too long before Jesus is born, and there's this whole sort of miracle annunciation thing to John's, parents and so on and so forth. This what we're talking here is around the year 36 to 37 CE. This is when the events that are described, which means right around the time of Jesus' ministry. Okay, and in fact, we learn of John. There's a different version of John's death in the Gospels, which is about the whole thing with Salome wanting his head. That's not here. And Jesus obviously from the Gospels, when John is executed by Herod Antipas, John's disciples scatter, and Jesus was one of them at the time. And again, John was Jesus' guru. He was his spiritual master, his Rebbe. There's no doubt about it. And then he went off and became a guru on his own. Interestingly enough, while I was at this retreat in Scotland, one of the people there is a young Hindu man from Oxford who is actually a couple of times in his life has been in an ashram. He is of the group of Hindus that worship Krishna as the avatar of God. And he was what we would call a Hare Krishna for a number of years. And I was asking him about spiritual leadership, talking about the difference with rabbinic ordination. And in essence, how do you become a Hindu priest? It used to be pretty much most of it was by your descent, but now it's people who attach themselves to a guru and spend a number of years with them, and at some point they decide they're ready to go off and be a leader. But what's interesting is that the only time that someone then becomes a guru is in the death of the old guru. So it's an interesting parallel, okay? So, but read on. So there's this, people thought that Herod Antipas's defeat by the king of Arabia came because he killed John the Baptist. This seems to be fairly clear, that Herod Antipas executed John the Baptist. The story in the Gospels is probably about Salome is probably fictional, all right? Go on. For Herod
slew him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness toward one another and piety toward God, and so to come to baptism.
Or immersion.
For that the washing with water would be acceptable to him if they made use of it, not in order to the putting away or the remission of some sins only, but for the purification of the body, supposing still that the soul was thoroughly purified beforehand by righteousness.
So notice, John uses the already well-established tradition of immersion in water as an act of purification, because, there's all these rules about purity in the Torah that use the immersion in water as a means of the purification of ritual uncleanliness. He's using it as a form of repentance. So he is read on. Now when
many others came in crowds about him, for they were greatly moved or pleased by hearing his words, Herod, who feared lest the great influence John had over the people might put it into his power and inclination to raise a rebellion, for they seemed ready to do anything he should advise, thought it best by putting him to death to prevent any mischief he might cause, and not bring himself into difficulties by sparing a man who might make him repent of it when it should be too late.
So John had this huge following, and Antipas, evidently this is part of Antipas' territory. He was worried that people would then begin to rebel him because Herod Antipas was not really liked by many people. Go on, accordingly.
Accordingly, he was sent a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus, the castle I before mentioned, and was there put to death. Now the Jews had an opinion that the destruction of this army was sent as a punishment upon Herod and a mark of God's displeasure against him.
That's it. That's the reference to John the Baptist. Okay? Now, when you look at the description of John the Baptist in the Gospels, the closest description you find in Josephus is to his own guru that he mentions in his autobiography when he went to live. He attaches himself to an Essene master. Very similar. And in the New Testament, John is located, his activities is located in the Jordan River Valley, because that's what he did. He wanted people to immerse in the Jordan, as opposed to an artificial mikvah, which would be under the control of the priestly authorities. All the mikvahs in Jerusalem, the public mikvahs, as opposed to the ones in the private homes, because most of the priests had one in their own home. We know that from archaeology. There were neighborhoods of the priests in Jerusalem where they all had private mikvahs in their own home, so they could prepare themselves before going to work in the temple. There were big public mikvahs outside one of the main public gates to the temple on the south wall. You can see them to this day, but they were under the control of the priests. So John, in effect, by using the river, was taking people out of that control. He was a revivalist, and the area that he preached in is not that far north of Qumran, which is, again, why we think, many scholars believe he was an Essene who came from Qumran. But if you look at the description of Josephus's guru and the description of John the Baptist in the New Testament, they are very similar in the kind of things they do. They wear rough clothing, they live in the wilderness, all this kind of stuff. But this is this is our only mention of John. And by the way, the fact that John's mentioned here is another reason why the Christians preserve Josephus. Okay, all right. I'm going to skip I'm going to skip to the third reference, which is Jesus' brother, James. If you take a look in Book 20 of the Antiquities, Chapter 9, on page 645. And by the way, the story of John is just completely within the narrative of the history he was telling at the time of Herod Antipas. It's not kind of, it perfectly fits in with the narrative flow. So if you take a look on 645, Book 20, Chapter 9, paragraph 1, which is line, what the point is, this is a discussion of the procurator Albinus, and we could, anyway, the point is, it's talking of, this guy Albinus wasn't sued, so good. We're talking here around 62 CE. So this is long after Jesus' death, when there is a small, the Christian community has begun to spread. Paul is active in the 40s, by the way. But this is about the Christian community in Jerusalem, or I will call them the Jesus followers at this point. So would somebody like to read? Robert, why don't you pick it up, line 200. When therefore Ananias was of this disposition. Ananias is the high priest. Remember, he's one of the high priests around the time of the revolt. This is just a few years before the revolt, okay?
He thought he had a now proper opportunity to exercise his authority. Festus was now dead, and Albinus was but upon the road. What does that mean?
Meaning, the old puricator was dead, a new one had been appointed, but hadn't yet gotten there. He hadn't gotten to so he thought, okay, now I can do what I want.
So he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges, and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others, or some of his companions, and when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned.
Stop there. So, a Sanhedrin, we have this idea that there's this if you take the rabbinic attitude, the rabbinic picture, there's a kind of Jewish Supreme Court / legislature called the Sanhedrin, made up of ordained judges. And the rabbis push this back into Jewish history, but the term Sanhedrin is a slippery term. It's not used that often in Josephus, and very often it just seems to be the name of a court. Now, the high priest had, as somebody well described it, a privy council that was made up of various people in Jerusalem, and it was just for Jerusalem, essentially. It really had no authority elsewhere. And again, depending upon the Romans, the high priest exercised a certain amount of authority over the running of the city, but it didn't really extend any there. So here it appears it's an ad hoc court. Now, in the New Testament, the Sanhedrin, appears to be this, something more stable and normal and whatever. So the high priest had a council of which there were Pharisees, and evidently there were Sadducees on it. It was probably dominated by Sadducees, which ran the city and ran the temple, because the temple is enormous administration. Because you have to understand, the temple was one of the largest religious compounds in the ancient world, and one of the most, the wealth. It had a huge treasury, and hundreds of thousands of people were coming and going all the time, especially on the holidays, Passover and Sukkot especially. So there was a large administration, and there were sacrifices being done every day of various kinds. So the Sanhedrin was the high priest's, privy council, and in fact, the second in command was the one who ran the day-to-day administration of the temple. So what happens? Because Albinus Festus was, yes, Robert.
Going back into what I just read, assuming it wasn't put in by one of the translators, Jesus, who was called Christ.
I'm going to get to that in a minute. Don't worry. Evidently, Ananus decides he wants to get rid of the leader of this community. So he puts James to death by stoning. Now, the brother of Jesus, and again, the name Jesus, this is the Greek / Latin form of a very common name. In Greek and Latin, you do not have an SH sound. Stop pronouncing it as a soft G, start pronouncing it as a Y, put in an SH, and take off the Greek ending US, and what do you end up with?
Yeshua.
Yeshua, Yehoshua, Joshua, right? In English. Some form, very similar root to Joshua. A form of Joshua. Very common name. You'll know there are all kinds of people that Josephus calls Jesus. Okay, so it's not a big deal.
That wasn't what I was getting at.
I'm getting there. Hold on. And James, of course, is a Greek form of a Jewish name as well. Okay, so probably Yirmiyahu, a form of Yirmiyahu or something like that, Jeremiah. Okay, so the point is, brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. Okay, here we get a really interesting issue. The term Christ in English has a very particular series of connotations because of Christianity, fully developed Christianity, which didn't exist at this time. Right? Mm-hmm. Jesus Christ, what does that mean to us today, or to a Christian?
Jesus the Messiah.
The Savior, part of the Trinity, all that kind of stuff. It's not, here, the Greek word is Christos. What does Christos mean? It's an exact translation of the Hebrew word Mashiach, the anointed one. Mashiach in Hebrew means the anointed one, which, except for a couple of instances in the Hebrew Bible, refers to the king. Because the king is the anointed of the Lord. Anointing meaning that the king was, at the coronation of the king, the appointment of the king was anointed with olive oil. That's what Samuel does to appoint Saul and appoint David, and so on and so forth. One other person in the Hebrew Bible is called the Mashiach. That's the high priest. Because the high priest, too, is anointed with oil in an ordination ceremony in the book of Exodus. So, it means the Lord's anointed, the king. It later, therefore, became the term for what we would call the Messiah. The English word comes from the Hebrew word. Because the Messiah was going to be the descendant of King David who would reestablish the Davidic kingdom in the Messianic era. Now, the concept of the Messiah at this time was not what later Judaism would, the rabbinic Judaism would define it, neither Christian concepts of what the Messiah is. It was very fluid at this time. There was not a single definition, and there were groups that believed in the notion of what we would call a Messianic era without a Messiah. There were also groups that believed there were going to be two Mashiachs, the one who would fight the wars and get killed, and then the one who would be the king. Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David. And you see this not just in rabbinic literature, it's in rabbinic literature. Okay? So it's a very complicated idea. So when you understand it that way, Jesus, who was called the Messiah, meaning that Jesus was, according to this report, thought to be the Messiah by his followers. That would be perfectly an accurate way to describe James.
Jesus, the anointed one.
Well, Jesus, who was thought to be the anointed one, hence the descendant of David, hence the Messiah. Right? Who was going to come, and of course the New Testament, two of the Gospels create a genealogy for Jesus that trace him back to David. Yes?
Was there any respect of them being a Kohen?
No, no. Interestingly enough, later rabbinic tradition makes the Messiah both the high priest and the king. Combines the two. But, so what we have from Josephus is there is a community of people in Jerusalem who had believed that Jesus of Nazareth, because that's where his family was from, was in fact the Messiah. And this group is headed up by his brother. And his brother is put to death by the high priest around just before the war. Now, the community in Jerusalem, from what we know, was the mother church. That was the center of the followers of Jesus. And they were all Jewish by ethnic affiliation. And the Jamesian church, as it's often referred to, there's a whole series of studies about Jamesian Christianity. That in effect, they were people who believed that Jesus was the Messiah, but they believed that the only people who could be a follower of Jesus had to be Jews.
Yeah.
Right. And he lost.
Right.
He lost for two. Well, first of all, it's a theory of some that Peter believed that the other people who could be part, and by the way, that James believed, and there's evidence from the book of Acts, that there was this council in the 40s where Paul was there. Paul sort of alludes to it as well, where they tried to establish the rules as to who could become part of the community. And according to that, James basically, there was a fight going on, and it would appear there were three factions. There was James, who said if you want to become a Jesus follower, you had to convert, and you weren't Jewish, you had to convert to Judaism. It meant circumcision for men. Then there was Peter, who believed that the God-fearers, who were Gentiles who followed Jewish law but had not formally converted, and we know from all kinds of sources there were lots of them. We even know they gave money to synagogues because their names are on plaques or on things that they contributed. Some ancient synagogues you find lists of donors carved into various things, and you have the Jews and you have the God-fearers in a separate category. So we know from a variety of sources the God-fearers attended synagogue. And by the way, eventually they became one of the primary first groups to become Christians, by the way. But nonetheless, Peter believed that you could be a God-fearer and be a follower of Jesus. You didn't have to formally convert to Judaism, but you had to follow Jewish law, which meant the big things were, of course, keeping kosher and practicing Shabbat. Then you had Paul, who says, no, ethnic Jewish Christians, that's fine. They should continue to follow the Jewish tradition, like himself. But you could be a Gentile who could become a follower of Jesus without conversion and without following Jewish law. And that's the group that ended up becoming a Christian, become what we call Christians. And so why did they succeed?
Because it was
That's
easy.
more than
Well, yeah, it was a little
Demands made.
easier. And Paul was really the one who went around creating all these communities. And if you look where he created them, they were outside of the main Jewish centers, as if to say, James and his followers say, yeah, okay, Paul, go. You can go to Jenemsveld, and But he was not. Paul tries to put a good spin on it, and so does the Book of Acts. But he wasn't in charge, and they were. He went out into the nowhere to create these communities. The main reason why this Jamesian group, the question is, did they survive? Did they not survive? They may have survived to a certain extent. There's some evidence. Some of them were in northern Saudi Arabia. There are references in the 2nd century by church authorities attacking groups of people who were practicing Jewish law, who were not Jews. It's very, very complicated. But
Who were where?
some of them seemed to be in northern Saudi Arabia, what we call northern Arabia, which may have had an influence on the rise of Islam. There's all kinds of interesting theories about the survival of the Jamesian church. But the fact is that most of them were killed in the war because they got stuck in the city. So one of the big reasons why the Pauline Christianity went out is that the Jamesian church got destroyed. I mean, think about what happened if they had survived. It would have, Jesus might have shown up in the Talmud as one of the, early sages. I mean, we just don't know. It's one of those strange historical things. That's what we learn. And most scholars believe this is an authentic passage. It's not an interpolation. It fits perfectly in with the historical context of ever. So those are the two passages that historians believe are authentic in Josephus. Now let's take up the one that everybody has the problems about.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
About Messiah.
Yeah.
The term Messiah.
Yeah.
It was my understanding, and am I wrong, that Christianity kind of worked backwards when they called Jesus the Messiah, and they just simply redefined the term Messiah?
No, I wouldn't say that. First of all, we don't actually know if Jesus thought he himself was the Messiah. His followers certainly thought he was.
Right. But what did that mean at the time?
Well, at the time, it meant something very different than what later Christianity did. But everything that Christianity said about the Messiah was based on Jewish trends that already existed in Judaism. That the Messiah could be a kind of semi-divine character. Okay?
That already exists.
Oh yeah, we have sources, Jewish sources that talk about the figure of the Messiah in kind of semi-divine ways. The idea that, look, Moses is spoken about as a semi-divine character, even in like Philo. Moses is not a normal human being. So it's a very, very complex thing. Like many things, most of Christian doctrine actually has Jewish roots and then goes off in a direction, that Rabbinic Judaism doesn't. Like original sin. There are Jewish sources from the 1st century that have a very similar context.
Really?
Oh yeah, even in Midrash, there are a few that are very suggestive of what we would call original sin. But the Christians make it a major doctrine. The notion of vicarious atonement, that Jesus died for our sins, exists in Jewish tradition before, outside of Christianity, okay?
Really?
Isaac died for our sins. There's all these midrashim that Isaac was actually
Really?
killed by Abraham then was resurrected, and that the death of Isaac there's this notion of what's called in Rabbinic Judaism schut avot, the merit of the ancestors, the idea that the ancestors build up a store of merit for us, and that especially martyrs also, and therefore on the high holidays, and you see this in the liturgy, we call upon God to remember the Kedah and the merit of the ancestors. So that is a Jewish form of vicarious atonement. Isaac died for our sins. It's there.
But that's if this is rabbinic, then that's well after
The
Jesus.
rabbis still had this idea. They just didn't take it in the direction Christianity did.
But then that doesn't predate Jesus.
No, they're building on something that was already there in the first century. Yeah, absolutely. There's a whole book written about this on the Akeda called The Last Trial by Schulman Spiegel, where he traces a lot of this. And its origin is obscure, but it comes from around the time of the origin of Christianity. Okay, so let's look at the passage that everybody has problems with, and this is on page 576.
That 18:3.
18, book 18, chapter 3, paragraph 3, line 116. Sorry, line 63. And this, according to the chronology of where he is in the writing, this is around the year 30 CE, which is exactly when Jesus was doing his ministry. The dates of Jesus are a little difficult to establish sometimes. So this would match with when the New Testament says Jesus was active in the Galilee after he separated from John. All right? The problem is that, and it's of course done during the time of, he's talking in the previous paragraph about the procurator Pilate, who was the one who put Jesus to death. And Pilate was a very bad procurator. He was in fact recalled and sent into exile. But then all of a sudden, and this is completely outside the narrative, by the way, there's this paragraph 3. So Robert, you want to pick that up again?
Now,
163?
there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher such as men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, and the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day.
Now, most modern scholars believe that this passage cannot be completely original to Josephus.
It sounds like.
What?
It sounds very much like the traditional.
Exactly, exactly. And it doesn't fit the narrative at the time either. The only thing that connects it is that this happened during the time of Pilate. So, we have 3 options here. One, we can say the whole passage was completely written later and just we should, ignore it totally. It's completely non-historical. That's one side. The other side is, oh no, the whole passage is authentic. Which is, of course, the traditional Christian approach. And in fact, this paragraph is the main reason why the Christians kept Josephus. This is known as the Testimonium. In other words, this is and by the way, this old translation has this huge thing at the back, defending the authenticity of the passage, by the way. Most scholars believe, however, that some of the passage is authentic. The question is, what parts of the passage is authentic? Okay, so I'm going to give you what most believe. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of wondrous works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over him many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him, and the tribe of Christians so named for him are not extinct to this day. Most scholars believe that's the authentic passage, because by Josephus' day, Christians began calling themselves Christians, which they didn't at first.
Okay, so Rabbi, just let's go over and let me
there's one-
underline what was
That's what I did
inserted.
in mine here, okay? Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man. Now, that's perfectly okay, because he was called, in Hebrew, it would be a chacham. And when you read the parables of Jesus, they are very much part of the wisdom tradition you find in the book of Proverbs and Ben Sira. In other words, he was a guru, like John. Okay, so that's authentic. Then you skip the next phrase. because if it be lawful to common man is obviously not the original. 4, he was a doer of wondrous works. Okay, he was reputed to have done healing miracles. Well, you know what? There were a lot of people who did that. Not a strange thing. So he healed people, okay? A teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He was, again, a guru, a teacher. He drew over to him many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. That would be the God-fearers.
And
Okay.
then he was the Christ is inserted.
Skip for the moment, he was the Christ. And continue with, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, crucifixion being a Roman execution. Why? Because, like John the Baptist, they considered him seditious. And by the way, if we extract the historical kernels from the gospel, that's exactly what he was. Because if he was proclaiming the end of time and the kingdom of God, that was disrupting the political order. The high priest establishment would be very upset with that kind of stuff. They didn't, I mean, you know, anybody who coming claiming, his followers claiming to be the Messiah, and the Romans themselves, you know, that's bad news. So not so difficult. Did not forsake him, despite his being arrested and killed. Meaning, they continued to follow his teachings after his death.
So you're saying that, and when Pilate did the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, that was inserted as well?
No, that's part of it. It's from and when Pilate, that's part of the original passage.
Okay.
At the suggestion of the principal among us had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him first did not forsake him. That's authentic. And by the way, there's evidence even from the New Testament that John the Baptist's followers continued to follow his teachings after his death. In fact, there may have been what we would call a gospel of John the Baptist. Because the followers of John the Baptist continued for decades after his death. There's evidence in the New Testament of that. And maybe even much longer than that. So then, you skip from forsake him, and to, and the tribe of Christians so named from him, are not extinct to this day. Most people believe that's the authentic passage. It fits with the narratives. It's a little aside about somebody that Pilate killed, like the story of John the Baptist who Herod Antipas killed. Now, so the whole thing after completely the idea he was resurrected on the third day. That's all. The question that some scholars have is the phrase "he was the Christ." Vermeesch, who was a very important scholar of this, said one should translate it as "he was called the Christ," which would actually then be authentic because he was called the Messiah. Meaning his followers called him the Messiah, which fits with the passage about James. So Vermeesch believes that phrase, if you get it right, is also authentic. Other people don't believe it is.
So, Rabbi, just for my clarification,
Yeah.
after the word cross with the mark,
No.
those that loved him
at the first did not forsake him. That's authentic.
for he appeared to them alive on the third day was inserted.
That's the later, yes.
As the divine prophets had foretold this and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him, that was also inserted.
Yes.
Okay.
So you have the phrase, if it lawful to be called a man, that's insertion. Probably he was called the Christ is an insertion, but definitely from for he appeared is an insertion until where it says and the tribe. Okay, so you take out those things, it's a perfectly reasonable discussion of a guy who was, like John, a teacher of wisdom, a miracle worker, who some people believe his followers believed in the Messiah. He attracted Jews, he attracted God-fearers, not a problem. I think that's probably correct. It makes sense to me. To excise the whole passage, I think just because you say, oh, well, it's all got to be wrong. People much wiser than I in these things have examined this very carefully and said, when you look at the language, it seems to fit. And, it's also because of the James passage. That's the issue. And some people think that some of the James passage might not be authentic, but it doesn't matter. So there it is. That's what we have. And this is really the only outside mention of Jesus is in Josephus. no Roman sources at the time of Jesus' life mention him. Later sources about the Christian community start showing up. But this is the reason why we have Josephus.
You're right.
This,
It's just remarkable that those few lines that were inserted have given us this whole tractate of history from that time.
But it's not only about that, it's also about the fact, as I said, Josephus provides the bridge for Christians between the end of the history of the story of the Israelites in the Tanakh and the Judeans to the beginning of the Christian community. It provides all the historical link to their own community. Yeah.
The fact that there are no Roman references suggests
Yeah.
that this was a small blip on their radar.
Absolutely. He was
I'm
not,
sorry, what was a small blip?
The
Josephus's
Christian.
work? Or what
Jesus
was
was
Jesus?
not important, not known.
Yeah.
Because one other. I mean, look, Josephus mentions these Essenes who were prophets, and they don't show up in Roman literature. I mean, you know, so why would the Romans mention him? He didn't have any impact. There was no Christian community in Rome at the time. Just nothing. It's only when they start spreading around, when Paul goes out there and creates these communities in Asia Minor, in Rome, they put Paul to death in Rome because they don't like him. The Christians then get persecuted for a variety of reasons.
But not until the 2nd century.
Nero, and then later on Domitian. No, in the 1st century they do. Why are they? I don't want to get into that now. But the point is, only when they start getting some traction.
When was Saul of Tarsus killed in Rome?
When?
Yeah.
I'm not sure, 50s sometime. And Peter too, by the way. There's all these Christian traditions about it. So, I mean, when the Christian community starts to become significant, and by the way, I mean, this division between the Jamesian church and the Pauline church, Elaine Padgels wrote a book recently on the book of Revelation, and she claims, with I think great justification, that the author of the book of Revelation was in fact an ethnic Jewish Christian who hated Pauline Christianity, and the people he's attacking in that book, who he calls the synagogues of Satan, are the Pauline churches. All right? And in fact, if you take the book of Revelation and you take out Jesus' name and you put in Messiah instead, it's a perfectly Jewish work. There are books, Apocalypse is written right around the same time, that are virtually identical, that are completely Jewish. And they're all based on the book of Daniel. So, again, nothing strange here, which for Jews it's hard to accept because we think it's so, this is such a Christian work. It's not. It's a Jewish work. Okay.
The term Christian, had that already been coined?
Well, by the time of Josephus, yes.
It already was.
Yeah, the Jesus, that's why scholars call the early group the Jesus followers, because they didn't call themselves Christians.
Right.
They didn't use the cross, was not used till much later. The original symbol for Christians was the fish, because the word in Greek fish can stand for a phrase which referred to Jesus as the Messiah. So the fish was the earliest Christian symbol. They didn't want to use the cross because it was a symbol of degradation. So it was only later that they started using it.
So Christianity is the name of the religion. That came later, right?
Well, even the concept of religion, the way we understand it, is actually a Protestant idea. But anyway, okay. So let's now look at Josephus's philosophy. And this is the material I gave you last week. If anybody not get it, I have a few copies. It's Lecture 4, Josephus's Theology of History. Maybe you can move the recorder back down my way. I gave this out last week. Yes. You need one? Here, you want to pass this down to Ellie? Okay. So, I think this is important because Josephus is we want to. I called him in the title. He was a traitor. All right, and the question is, why did he turn tail? In other words, why did he go over the Romans? Why didn't he just kill himself or die in battle or whatever? What happened? And I think it's important because, in effect, his perspective on this was the mainstream. It was a very old Jewish idea. Certainly of a priestly family would have reflected that. And it has its roots in the Tanakh itself. in the experience of the Babylonian exile. And it's found, first of all, in the book of Jeremiah, which is why I wanted you to have the Tanakh, because I wanted to look at these passages, because these are critical passages for later Jewish history, all the way up to the 19th century. In other words, with the rise of Jewish nationalism in the 19th century, of which Zionism became the greatest expression of Jewish nationalism, but there was Jewish nationalism in Europe before there was Zionism. The notion of Jewish self-determination is a modern idea. The ruling theology that governed the Jewish community from the time of Jeremiah until the rise of Jewish nationalism in the 19th century, with four major exceptions, is God wants you to be where you are and you don't revolt against the ruling power, because that's God's will. Only 4 times did Jews, there were some minor revolts under the Parthians and whatever, there were only 4 times when the Jews revolted against the ruling authority to try and achieve independence and self-determination.
So the idea of going back to the return to David is...
You wait for God to bring it about. You don't try to bring it about yourself. And by the way, the ultra-Orthodox who are anti-Zionist, they're following the old traditional Jewish idea. Okay? You have to accept the fact, They believe for Jews to create their own state without the Messiah and is against the will of God. Okay, so what are the 4 times? The Maccabean Revolt. Successful, right? Second time, the war against the Romans during Josephus' life. Result, disaster. And by the way, the fact that the Jews had been successful under the Maccabees was one of the things that pushed them against the Romans. Figure, hey, we did it once, we'll do it again, right? And God wants us to do this, and God is telling us that we shouldn't be on. So that's the second one. Third one was the revolt of the Jews in Alexandria, Cyprus, and Cyrene that occurred between 115 and 117. Disaster. Fourth one, the Bar Kokhba revolt, where they thought Bar Kokhba was the Messiah. Worst disaster. After that, and this was incorporated very clearly into Rabbinic Judaism, you don't revolt against the ruling power. I mean, think about it. Some of the rabbis participated in the Bar Kokhba revolt, like Rabbi Akiva, and where did it get them? Subsequently, the rabbis played ball with the Romans. There's no doubt about it. And when you look at every Jewish community after that, for the most part, they tried to play ball with the ruling power. And they looked to the ruling power for protection.
Rabbi, what
Yeah.
was the third example?
The 115 to 117, the revolt of the Jews in Alexandria, Cyrene, and Cyprus, for which we only have minimal documentation because there's no Josephus to have written it. So when you look at the whole of Jewish history after that, the pattern is you play ball with the ruling power. If they persecute you, okay, then you can try and resist. If they pass laws against Jewish practice, you try to resist it to the point of martyrdom. You do whatever you can to get by, which in the Russian Empire meant, you bribe officials if you have to, you cheat the government if you have to, but you don't revolt. A cousin of mine, much older, now long gone, who remembered what the situation was like in my grandfather's hometown, once wrote, his name was Joe Salzberg, once wrote that in the town, they really got upset if an honest official was appointed. Because then they couldn't bribe him, and that was the only way they could get by, was bribing the government officials. But they didn't revolt against the government officials. Okay, so where does it come from? We have a few minutes left. Take a look, chapter 25 of the book of Jeremiah. We're going to start in verse 8 on page 1072. Ellie, do you want to read from Assuredly Thus Said the Lord of Hosts?
Assuredly thus said the Lord of Hosts, because you would not listen to my words, I am going to send for all the peoples of the north, declares the Lord.
Just stop there. We're on page 1072, chapter 25, verse 8. Go on.
And for my servant King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and bring them against this land and its inhabitants, and against all those nations round about. I will exterminate them, and make them a desolation, an object of hissing, ruins for all time.
Okay, stop there. And if you keep going down a little further, again, it refers to the idea, all right, skip to verse 12, when the 70, no, just start where, and those nations.
And those nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. When the 70 years are over, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation and the land of the Chaldeans for their sins, declares the Lord, and I will make it a desolation for all time.
Okay, we can stop there. So what are the two functions? Nebuchadnezzar's coming down to destroy Judea and the temple is an act of God, and who Nebuchadnezzar is referred to as my servant. Secondly, Babylon will rule for 70 years, and at the end of 70 years, the Babylonians will be punished. These are two critical ideas. Okay? Okay, so now let's go to, and this prophecy takes place in 605 BCE, some 20 years before the final destruction of Jerusalem. So now look at chapter 27, beginning in verse 2. And this, from verse 1, we date to around 606. It's around the same time as the first one. Ellie, do you want to pick it up at verse 2? Thus said the
Lord to me, make for yourself thongs and bars of the yoke, and put them on your neck.
Okay, we can stop there. Jeremiah is going to do what we would call street theater, and put on a yoke and walk around as a symbol of what's happening, and then another guy comes and breaks the yoke. Anyway, skip to verse 5. It is I who made the earth.
It is I who made the earth, and the men and the beasts who are on the earth, by my great might and my outstretched arm, and I give it to whomever I deem proper.
Okay, I'm the one who directs all the human affairs. I am the God of history, and everything that happens in this world is my direct will. Go on.
I herewith deliver all these lands to my servant King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon.
We can stop there with this passage. All right, most important passage, chapter 29. Now, chapter 29 takes place in 597 BCE. And you have to understand, there was 3 deportations that took place by the Babylonians. There was the deportation that the king of Judea was exiled with his family and a lot of the court officials. That was around 598 BCE. And then there was the destruction of Jerusalem in 586, where there was a second deportation. And then there was a third deportation when Gedaliah, the governor who had been appointed by the Babylonians, was assassinated. So there are 3 deportations. So Josephus is writing a letter to the community that's in exile in 597 BC. This is while Jerusalem is still standing. What happens is the king's brother, Zedekiah, is put on the throne by the Babylonians as a puppet king. He then, being somewhat of an idiot, it appears, decides to revolt against the Babylonians. So this is a letter to the exile community. It's very significant. Ellie, do you want to, maybe Jackie, why don't you pick it up? This is the text of the letter.
This is the text of the letter which the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the priests, the prophets, and the rest of the elders of the exiled community, and to all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon, after King Jeconiah, the queen mother, the eunuchs, the officials of Judah and Jerusalem, and the craftsmen and the smiths had left Jerusalem. The letter was sent through son of
Shaphan,
and
Gemariah, son of Hilkiah,
and whom King
Zedekiah
of Judah had dispatched to Babylon, to King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon.
There were ambassadors that went back and forth between King Zedekiah and his brother in Babylon. So this letter was put in the diplomatic pouch. And the two guys mentioned, Elasa, son of Shaphan, and Gamaliel, son of Hilkiah, these are well-known court officials. In fact, Jeremiah had close connections with the family, the Shaphan family and the Gamaliel, and they actually have found the seals of, I think, a couple of these people, okay? So Jeremiah had very close connections with the court. So here's the letter that he put in the pouch. Read on. Thus said the Lord of hosts.
Thus said the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to the whole community, which I exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their fruit. Take wives and beget sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons, and give your daughters to husbands, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, do not decrease, and seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its prosperity you shall prosper.
What's the message?
Make good in a
Stay
foreign land.
put. Pray for the peace of the city. This is the origin of the prayer for the country that we recite every Shabbat. And when you look in an Orthodox Siddur for that prayer, some of the language of this is preserved in the original. So, you are to stay put. Live your lives there. Support the local regime. Okay? And then, in effect, in the next couple of verses, he says, don't listen to any prophets who tell you otherwise. Okay?
Where is that?
The verses 8 and 9. And then pick it up in verse 10. This is another significant passage. Go on. For thus said the Lord.
For thus said the Lord, when Babylon's 70 years are over, I will take note of you, and I will fill to you my promise of favor, to bring you back to this place. For I am mindful of the plans I have made concerning you, declares the Lord, plan for your welfare, not for disaster, to give you a hopeful future.
So, it's going to last 70 years. And then later on, verse 12, it says, if you pray to me where you are, I will listen. In other words, don't think that you're disconnected from me just because you can't sacrifice. And there's other texts from the exile that suggest this notion that prayer, this is the beginning of the idea that prayer can replace sacrifice, by the way. And the passage goes on all the way through to verse 14. The letter keeps going. But the point is, this sets the limit of the exile at 70 years. And the other text that I've given you here from 2nd Isaiah and the book of Ezra are all after 539 BCE and refer to the idea that, in fact, Jeremiah was right. The exile lasted 70 years. Cyrus, when the Persians conquered the Babylonians, Cyrus the Great gives his edict to allowing the Jews. It's 70 years. It's like, my gosh, he got it right, okay? So this becomes a significant thing in later Jewish history. So when you look in the book of Daniel, and I've given you the quote here, which is at the time of the Antiochian persecutions, around the time of the Maccabean Revolt, approximately, certainly post 167 BCE, they've reinterpreted this 70 years to refer to foreign domination. Okay? That it's like 7 times 70, things of that sort. So this whole idea then becomes a significant point that after 70 years, you're going to come back. But the main tenor of this is don't do anything. God will do it. And by the way, it's one of the reasons why the Bar Kokhba revolt broke out when it did, because it was 70 years after the destruction of the temple, almost. And they said, okay, it's time, guys. But the point is, the ruling theology all that time, and when you look at the hundreds, over 1,000 years of Jewish, sort of living with a foreign empire, the Persians, they never revolted against the Persians. Most of the time they were under the Hellenistic empires, except for the Maccabean Revolt. The Romans, first the Romans and then what we call the Byzantines, for hundreds and hundreds of years, with those 4 exceptions, the Jews played ball. Which, by the way, when you look at some of the prophecy, the material from the beginning of the Second Temple, there were those who were really like, what the heck's going on? I thought we were going to get to reestablish the independent Judea under a Davidic king, and instead we're just this little tiny province under the Roman Empire. There was a great deal of disillusionment after the exile was over. And so in some ways, this is a transposition of explaining why you are still under foreign rule. And that's the philosophy that undergird those in the Jewish community, especially the priests, who didn't want to revolt against the Romans. They were saying we've got to, we are, it's not merely we're smart because the Romans are going to come and kill us, which is also, by the way, one of their rationales, but God doesn't want us to do this. It's wrong. And we will be punished if we do this.
But wasn't he the general before that?
Yeah, but that's why he turned tail. That's my point. He goes back to this, as we will see. He specifically talks a philosophy which is virtually identical, that if the Romans are ruling us, it's because God wants this to be the case. Yes?
But what happened in 1947 to change it?
Oh, it didn't start in 47. It started in the 19th century. And the reaction against this philosophy was secular. You have to understand, Jewish nationalism was a secular phenomenon that said, we can't live anymore under this. Look what the Russians did to us in the pogroms. Look at the anti-Semitism. We can no longer rely, to quote Blanche Dubois, on the kindness of strangers anymore. We have to rule ourselves. The very first major statement of this was a guy named Pinsker, who wrote a pamphlet called Auto-Emancipation, 10 years before Herzl. It's not Zionism yet, it's Jewish nationalism. Pinsker, who was a poster boy for assimilation into the local culture, Leon Pinsker, it's really one of the most important Jewish documents of the modern period. He said, he was a guy, he was brought up by a secular Jewish family. He went into the Russian army as a doctor. He was given a medal by the Tsars after the Crimean War for his work with being a doctor. And then the pogroms break out, and it's like he's completely disillusioned. And he writes this pamphlet that in effect says, we can't follow this anymore. God helps those who help themselves. As he ends up with that, by the way. And we have to, and then he quotes Hillel, if I am not for myself, who will be for, right? In other words, he calls for Jews to take their fate into their own hands. But he's a secularist, more or less.
What was the title of the book?
Auto-Emancipation by Leon Pinsker. If you look at the book, The Zionist Idea by late Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, most of it is in there. Okay? So Zionism is part of and the most successful expression of this idea that we must now take our fate into our own hands, create our own state, rule ourselves, and not rely on the kindness of strangers. And that's a repudiation of this Jeremiah philosophy that had been in effect for 2,500 years, with those four exceptions. Yes, Robert?
How do they pass? It will last 70 years with the 2.5 millennia we're not going. Because that's where the wise men come in.
Yes.
But the fact is, it's written here, 70 years, guys, and it's going to be over.
Yeah. Well, what happens is that Daniel reinterprets it to his day, which is over 490 years. You know what I mean? In other words, people end up with various kinds of things, or they ignore Daniel. But it undergirds a lot of the modern, the apocalyptic visions of some of the extreme fundamentalist Christian groups, right? They pick all this stuff up, okay? And it's reinterpreted in the book of Revelation that becomes part of the New Testament. So it's a very powerful, the idea that there's a limited time period, and that was part of the problem. Jews were always trying to calculate, okay, so when is the Messiah coming? Precisely because they felt the sting of foreign rule as being a humiliation. I mean, Maimonides writes about this. And Maimonides himself, although he basically followed the Jeremiah philosophy, had a family tradition that the Messiah was going to come sometime in what we would call the 13th century, which would have dated it after his death. The point is, Jews were always trying to calculate the end. And there were Jewish messianic movements like Shabtai Tzvi, and they always ended in disaster. So it just reaffirmed this idea. Yeah, Jackie.
Yeah, I just want to comment, because as strongly as I feel about Zionism, okay?
Yeah.
I think we have to give credit to the fact that this philosophy allowed, in many ways, the Jews to survive for 2,000 years.
Yes, it did.
Because of the examples of what would have happened if they were revolting.
Right, exactly. And you're right. The thing is, modern Jewish nationalism says that philosophy had come to an end.
Right.
And I think most Jews would agree with that today.
But I think we have to understand what was going on pre-World War II. You have to
Even
understand that this was a long tradition.
Pre-1880 is really, it's before 1880. And I think you're absolutely right. We have to understand, and it explains the anti-Zionism of the ultra-Orthodox. Look, I'm a modern Jew. I believe in this idea that we must have self-determination.
Right, yeah.
But we also should, you're right, understand how we survived before. And to those extremists who think that somehow Israel can go it alone and doesn't need the United States or anybody else, that to me is like going too far in the other direction.
It's like...
It's a disaster.
Right, and by the way, these are very similar to the people who were like the Zealots, who said, God's going to come and save us. It doesn't matter what happens. And that's a very dangerous idea.
Actually, yesterday Rabbi Kwiatkowski was talking, and he was talking about how the groups in the West Bank and stuff who said, Gaza wouldn't be evacuated because God wouldn't allow it.
Right, exactly. It's the same thing. So just to finish up, there are two passages that I want to look at from Josephus. The first one, we don't have to read the whole thing because it's quite long, but if you want to read it, go ahead. And this, interestingly enough, takes place in the spring of 66, when things are beginning to boil over. The revolt hasn't formally started yet, and it's a speech of Herod Agrippa II, Josephus's friend and patron. It's in second book of the Jewish Wars, chapter 16. It's a long speech, and obviously it's a reconstructed speech with incredible rhetoric, and we're not going to look at it now. We'll start with parts of it, but read it over if you can. It's on pages 743 to 747. It's Herod Agrippa II trying to stop the people from revolting, and he goes through some very practical reasons why and all kinds of things, but when you read it, you see this theology at work. Again, did Herod Agrippa actually say this? I wouldn't put it past him, because he was part of the group that never revolted. He left. He had to run for his life, basically, he and his wife, from the revolutionaries. The second speech, and again, I'm only giving you part of it because it's quite, well, you can read the whole thing if you want. Josephus is asked by Titus to go to the walls of Jerusalem during the beginning of the siege and call out to the revolutionaries to stop. Of course, they won't listen to him, and they try and kill him by throwing stones and arrows at him. But we're going to look at his speech, that one in a little more detail, because there he very clearly lays it out. Again, he employs both the practical as well as the theological, because he's writing for a non-Jewish audience. And so, and both of them, by the way, employ history as well. Look at the history of who, how the Romans have defeated everybody. What makes you think you're going to be able to do it? So we'll take a look at those, and then we will go directly into the war, and we'll look at excerpts tracing the war from its beginning to its end. See you next week.